The Pacific had teeth tonight. Lieutenant Commander Maren Solberg felt the USS Resolute heave beneath her boots as another 30-foot swell rolled onto the hull, sending unsecured equipment sliding across the deck. Most of the crew had turned green hours ago, clutching railings and swallowing hard against the relentless pitch and yaw. Maren stood at the port observation station with her clipboard pressed against her chest, watching the black water churn below, and felt something close to peace. Before we continue with this story, drop a comment and let us know what state or country you are watching from tonight. Perhaps you have a connection to naval service yourself, or maybe you grew up near the ocean and understand its power. We would love to hear from you. She had been aboard for 6 days now, playing the role of civilian hydrographic surveyor with the kind of quiet competence that invited neither praise nor suspicion. Her cover documentation identified her as a contractor from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, tasked with collecting bathymetric data during the joint naval exercise. It was a role designed to be forgettable, and Maren had spent years perfecting the art of being overlooked. The hatch behind her clanged open, and heavy boots struck the wet deck. She did not need to turn around to know who it was. Gunnery Sergeant Wade Huxley had made his feelings about her presence abundantly clear from the moment she stepped aboard. Well, Huxley announced to no one in particular, his voice cutting through the wind and spray. Look who is out enjoying the weather. Most civilians would be crying into a bucket right about now. Maren kept her eyes on her clipboard, making a notation that meant nothing. The motion does not bother me, she replied evenly. I grew up on fishing boats in Maine. Huxley moved closer, flanked by 2 Marines she had come to recognize as Corporal Deacon Fitch and Lance Corporal Theo Brandt. The 3 of them formed a wall of hostile muscle between her and the interior hatch. Fishing boats, Huxley repeated with theatrical contempt. So you're telling me that gutting cod prepared you for a combat vessel during fleet exercises? I am telling you that rough water is not new to me, Gunnery Sergeant. Something flickered in Huxley's expression, a tightening around the jaw that suggested her calm was not the response he wanted. He was a broad man with a face that looked like it had been carved from weathered oak, all hard angles and permanent scowl lines. 3rd-generation Marine, she had learned from the ship's gossip network. His grandfather had stormed beaches in the Pacific. His father had bled in Vietnam. Wade Huxley carried that legacy like a weapon, and he wielded it against anyone he deemed unworthy of sharing deck space with real warriors. What I cannot figure out, he continued, stepping close enough that she could smell the coffee on his breath, is why Command approved having a civilian scientist cluttering up my ship during a critical exercise. We have real work to do out here. War games. Combat d'Inesdrid. And somehow we got saddled with a woman who wants to measure how deep the water is. Fitch snickered on cue. Brandt said nothing, but his eyes darted toward the churning sea with something that might have been nervousness. Maren finally looked up, meeting Huxley's gaze with the practiced blankness she had perfected during years of operating in environments far more hostile than this. My work was authorized by Naval Surface Forces Pacific, she said. If you have concerns about my presence, I suggest you take them up the chain of command. The muscles in Huxley's neck corded visibly. He was not accustomed to civilians who failed to wither under his attention. "Oh, I intend to," he growled. "But until I get you removed from this vessel, understand something. You're a guest here, a tolerated inconvenience. You stay out of the way of my Marines. You do not speak unless spoken to, and you remember every single second that you do not belong here." He held her gaze for a long moment, waiting for the flinch, the apology, the feminine retreat he clearly expected. When none came, his lip curled into something ugly. "We're watching you," he said finally, "and the ocean out here does not care about authorization letters." He turned and stalked back toward the hatch, his Marines falling in a step behind him. Only Brandt glanced back, and for just a moment, Maren thought she saw something like doubt in his young face before the hatch slammed shut and left her alone with the storm. She returned her attention to the water, but her mind was elsewhere now. 6 days of this treatment, escalating daily. Equipment moved from where she left it. Her bunk short-sheeted like a schoolyard prank. Meals that arrived cold or not at all. Huxley was testing her, probing for weakness, and every failure to find it only increased his determination. What none of them knew, what none of them could possibly suspect, was that Maren Solberg had endured tests that would have broken Wade Huxley in the first hour. She had survived Hell Week on 2 hours of sleep. She had swum miles through freezing surf with her hands bound. She had held her breath until her vision went black and then held it longer because her instructors demanded it. The Pacific heaved again, sending spray across the deck in a freezing curtain. Maren closed her eyes and let it wash over her. Somewhere below the surface, in the black depths that terrified most sailors, she sensed something moving, something that did not belong. She opened her eyes and stared into the darkness, and the darkness seemed to stare back. The memory came to her unbidden as she descended the ladder toward her berth, hands moving automatically on the rain-licked rungs. Coronado Island, 3 years ago. The pool at the Naval Special Warfare Center, its waters deliberately churned to simulate combat conditions. Instructor Castellanos, standing at the edge with a stopwatch and a voice like broken gravel, screaming that she was not tired, that she had not earned tired, that tired was a privilege reserved for operators who survived their first deployment. She had been underwater for 4 minutes when her vision started to tunnel. The other candidates had already surfaced, gasping and defeated, washing out of the program one by one. But Maren had stayed down, her lungs screaming, her body demanding air with every desperate nerve ending, because she understood something the others did not. The water was not her enemy. The water was home. She simply had to remember how to live there. She surfaced at 4 minutes and 47 seconds. Instructor Castellanos had stared at her with something that might have been respect, or might have been the recognition of one predator acknowledging another. The fluorescent lights of the ship's interior corridor snapped her back to the present. Maren moved through the narrow passage with the unconscious grace of someone accustomed to tight spaces, nodding at the sailors she passed, but inviting no conversation. Her cover required invisibility, and invisibility required discipline. Her berth was a converted storage compartment, barely large enough for the fold-down cot and the small desk where she kept her surveying equipment. When she pushed open the door, she knew immediately that someone had been inside. The violation was subtle but unmistakable. Her equipment case had been moved 3 inches to the left. The blanket on her cot had been pulled tight in a way she never made it. And there, scattered across her pillow like a threat wrapped in childish cruelty, were a dozen dead fish heads. Their glassy eyes stared at nothing, mouths frozen in silent accusation. Maren stood in the doorway for a long moment, cataloging the scene with the clinical detachment of a crime scene investigator. The fish were fresh, likely pulled from the galley stores within the last few hours. The placement was deliberate, designed to shock and disgust, and the message was clear enough that even a civilian would understand it. You do not belong here. You smell like fish. Go back to your fishing boats and leave the real work to us. She gathered the fish heads without expression, deposited them in the waste receptacle, and stripped the contaminated pillowcase with efficient movements. There would be no report filed. No complaint registered. That was exactly what Huxley wanted, an excuse to paint her as a troublemaker, a woman who could not handle the rough humor of military life. Besides, Maren had endured far worse during SEER training. 3 weeks of simulated captivity, interrogation resistance, and survival in hostile conditions. They had waterboarded her. They had kept her in a box too small to sit upright for 16 hours. They had played recordings of her family being threatened, testing whether she would break her cover to save people she loved. Dead fish on her pillow barely registered as an inconvenience. She was securing the fresh bedding when a knock came at her door. Maren opened it to find Chief Petty Officer Yolanda Reese standing in the corridor, her dark features arranged in an expression of professional neutrality that did not quite mask the curiosity beneath. "Miss Solberg," Reese said, "Captain Drummond asked me to inform you that the weather advisory has been extended. We will be maintaining reduced operations for the next 48 hours. Your surveying work will need to wait." "I understand, Chief. Thank you for letting me know." Reese did not leave. Instead, her eyes swept past Maren into the small compartment, taking in the stripped cot, and the faint smell of fish that still lingered despite Marin's cleaning efforts. She was a compact woman in her early 40s, with the kind of weathered competence that came from decades of proving herself in spaces that were not designed for her. "You seem to be adjusting well to shipboard life," Reese observed, and there was a question buried somewhere in the statement. "I spent my childhood on boats," Marin replied. "The adjustment is not difficult." Reese nodded slowly, but her eyes remained sharp. "I was a rescue swimmer for 12 years before I transferred to surface operations," she said. "Spent more time in the water than on land for most of my 20s. You learn to read people when you pull them out of the ocean. You learn who belongs there and who is just visiting." Marin kept her expression neutral, but something cold moved through her chest. Reese was perceptive, perhaps too perceptive. "What do you read in me, Chief?" A long pause. The ship groaned around them as another swell passed beneath the hull. Reese's eyes never left Marin's face. "I read someone who is comfortable in places that should terrify them," Reese said finally. "I read someone who has made peace with the water in a way that takes years to develop. And I read someone who is very, very good at appearing to be less than they are." The silence stretched between them, heavy with implication. Marin understood that she was standing at a crossroads. She could maintain her cover with a dismissive laugh, or she could acknowledge what Reese was suggesting without confirming anything specific. "I have always loved the ocean," Marin said carefully. "Perhaps that love shows in ways I cannot control." Reese studied her for another moment, then nodded once. "Perhaps it does," she agreed. "Get some rest, Ms. Solberg. Something tells me you might need it before this exercise is over." She turned and walked away, her footsteps fading into the mechanical symphony of the ship. Marin closed her door and leaned against it, allowing herself one slow breath of something that was not quite concerned but lived in the same neighborhood. Her cover was holding, but cracks were beginning to show. And somewhere in the dark water beneath the Resolute, she could feel the enemy circling closer. The storm did not relent. If anything, it grew teeth overnight, transforming the Pacific into a heaving gray monster that battered the Resolute with waves that seemed personal in their fury. By morning, half the crew was confined to quarters with seasickness, and the ship's operations had ground down to essential functions only. Marin used the chaos as cover. While most personnel focused on keeping their breakfast where it belonged, she slipped into the small survey station she had been assigned and powered up her equipment. The hydrographic sensors were legitimate tools, standard issue for oceanographic research, but they had been modified before her deployment in ways that would not appear in any official documentation. She calibrated the passive sonar array and began her sweep, letting the data scroll across her screen in patterns that would look like meaningless noise to an untrained observer. But Marin's eyes had been trained to find meaning in chaos. She had spent 18 months with Naval Special Warfare Development Group, learning to read the ocean's secrets, to distinguish the mechanical heartbeat of a submarine from the biological symphony of marine life. There, a pattern that did not belong, faint but unmistakable, hovering at the edge of detection like a predator waiting in tall grass. She ran the signature through her mental database. Diesel-electric propulsion, probably a Kilo class or similar design. Running silent at approximately 200 meters depth, matching the Resolute's course and speed with the kind of precision that screamed hostile intent. This was not a coincidental contact. This was surveillance. Marin's training demanded immediate action. Protocol required her to break cover, identify herself to the captain, and coordinate a response through proper channels. But her mission parameters were explicit. She was here to assess the crew's readiness and identify security vulnerabilities, not to intervene unless absolutely necessary. Breaking cover prematurely would compromise months of planning and potentially expose the assessment program to the very personnel it was designed to evaluate. She copied the contact data to an encrypted file and secured her equipment. The submarine would wait. For now, she needed to maintain her invisibility and continue gathering intelligence on the crew's operational security. The corridor outside her survey station was empty, except for a young sailor rushing past with a mop and bucket, presumably on his way to clean up after someone who had lost their battle with the ship's motion. Marin moved in the opposite direction, heading toward the mess hall for what passed as breakfast during reduced operations. She did not make it halfway there. Corporal Fitch materialized from a side passage, his bulk filling the narrow corridor with aggressive intention. His face carried the particular expression of someone who had been waiting for this moment, who had perhaps been watching her movements and calculating the optimal time to strike. "Well, look at this," Fitch announced, his voice echoing off the metal walls. "The fish lady is up and walking around like she owns the place. How did you sleep last night? Comfortable pillow?" Marin stopped, keeping her weight balanced and her hands relaxed at her sides. She had been trained to disable opponents twice Fitch's size in under 3 seconds, but that training came with strict rules of engagement. Civilian cover meant civilian responses. She could not put this man through a bulkhead without answering questions she was not prepared to answer. "I slept fine," she replied evenly. "Thank you for your concern." Fitch stepped closer, close enough that she could see the broken capillaries in his nose and smell the tobacco on his uniform. His eyes held the gleam of someone who enjoyed the fear he saw in others, who fed on the power differential between predator and prey. The problem was, Marin was not prey. She had never been prey, and maintaining the illusion was becoming increasingly difficult. "You think you are tough," Fitch said softly, standing out there in the storm like it did not bother you, acting like you belong on a warship. "But I know what you are. You're a pencil pusher playing dress-up, and when this exercise is over, you're going to crawl back to your office and tell stories about how brave you were." Marin said nothing. She simply watched him, cataloging his stance, his balance, the way he telegraphed his intentions through the tension in his shoulders. "Nothing to say?" Fitch leaned closer still. "That is what I thought. All that calm is just an act. Inside, you are terrified. I can smell it on you." The ship lurched suddenly, a particularly violent roll that sent loose equipment crashing somewhere in the distance. Fitch stumbled, his hand shooting out to brace against the wall. Marin did not move. Her feet remained planted, her balance perfect, as if the ship's motion was simply another element she had long ago learned to dance with. For just a moment, something flickered in Fitch's expression. Confusion, the beginning of doubt. People did not stand like that on a rolling ship. Not without years of training. Not without the kind of sea legs that took a lifetime to develop. "Who the hell are you?" he breathed. Before Marin could respond, footsteps approached from behind. She turned to find Captain Ansel Drummond striding toward them, his silver hair disheveled, and his uniform bearing the wrinkles of a man who had not slept well. His eyes moved between Marin and Fitch, reading the situation with the speed of someone who had commanded ships for 3 decades. "Corporal," the captain said coldly, "do you not have duties to attend to?" Fitch snapped to attention, his face flushing. "Yes, sir. Just checking on the civilians, sir. Making sure she was handling the weather." "I am certain Ms. Solberg can handle herself," Drummond replied. "Dismissed." Fitch retreated, but not before shooting Marin a look that promised their conversation was far from finished. When he was gone, Drummond turned to her with an expression that was difficult to read. "Ms. Solberg," he said quietly, "walk with me. I believe we need to have a conversation about exactly what kind of surveys you are conducting on my ship." Captain Drummond led her through a maze of corridors toward the bridge, his silence more unnerving than any interrogation. Marin matched his pace, her mind racing through contingency protocols. If he had discovered her true identity through official channels, he would have summoned her formally. This informal approach suggested suspicion rather than certainty, which meant she still had room to maneuver. They entered the bridge, where a skeleton crew monitored instruments through the storm's assault. Drummond gestured toward a small chart room adjacent to the main command center, waiting until the door closed behind them before speaking. "I have been a naval officer for 32 years, he began, his voice pitched low enough that it would not carry beyond the walls. "I have served with every kind of sailor this fleet produces. I know how civilians behave on warships. I know how scientists behave when they are out of their depth. And I know, Ms. Solberg, that you are neither of those things." Marin kept her expression neutral. "Captain, I assure you that my credentials are legitimate. If you would like to contact Noah directly, they will confirm my assignment." Drummond's weathered face remained impassive. "I have no doubt your paperwork is impeccable. I am equally certain that whoever created it is very good at their job. What interests me is why Naval Surface Forces Pacific would approve a civilian surveyor for an exercise that was classified as restricted access until 72 hours before departure." He moved to the chart table, resting his hands on its surface as if drawing strength from the familiar navigation tools spread before him. "I am not a fool," he continued. "I know there are operations above my clearance level. I know there are people who move through my ship wearing faces that are not their own. What I need to understand is whether you are here to help my crew or to evaluate them for failure." The question hung between them like smoke. Marin understood that she had arrived at another crossroads, more dangerous than her conversation with Chief Reese. Drummond was not fishing for information. He had already drawn conclusions. What he wanted now was confirmation, and perhaps reassurance that his ship was not about to become a casualty of some interagency power struggle. She made a calculated decision. "Captain, I am not at liberty to discuss the specifics of my assignment, but I can tell you that I am not your enemy, and I am not here to sabotage your command. There are elements of this exercise that extend beyond the official parameters. My presence is related to those elements." Drummond studied her for a long moment, his eyes carrying the weight of decades spent reading people in crisis. "You move like someone with training," he said finally. "Not civilian training. The way you handled that confrontation with Corporal Fitch. The way you stood on a rolling deck like you were bolted to it. Those are not skills you learn on fishing boats." "My background is more extensive than my cover suggests," Marin admitted. "That is all I can say." The captain exhaled slowly, a man making peace with uncertainty. "Very well, Ms. Solberg. I will not press further. But understand that this is my ship and these are my people. If your mission puts them at risk, I expect to be informed. Whatever authorities you answer to, I answer to the men and women under my command first." Marin nodded, allowing genuine respect to color her voice. "I understand, Captain. And for what it is worth, I believe you run a disciplined ship. The issues I have observed are confined to a small number of personnel." Drummond's jaw tightened. Gunnery Sergeant Huxley and his associates. "Yes, I am aware of the situation." He hesitated, something shifting behind his eyes. "Huxley is a complicated case. Excellent service record. Commendations from 3 previous commands. But he carries something dark in him, something that surfaces when he feels his territory is threatened. I have been documenting the incidents." That surprised her. "You know about the harassment?" "I know about everything that happens on my ship," Drummond replied. "The question is how to address it without creating a larger problem. Huxley has allies in the fleet. Powerful ones. Moving against him requires evidence that cannot be dismissed as interpersonal conflict." Before Marin could respond, the bridge intercom crackled to life. "Captain Drummond to Combat Information Center. Priority contact." Drummond's expression hardened. He moved past her toward the door, pausing with his hand on the frame. "We will continue this conversation later, Ms. Solberg. In the meantime, I suggest you stay alert. The ocean out here is full of things that do not appear on official charts." He disappeared through the hatch, leaving Marin alone with the navigation maps and the growing certainty that events were accelerating beyond her control. The priority contact could mean anything, but her instincts whispered that it was connected to the submarine's signature she had detected earlier. She needed to access the Combat Information Center's sensor data without revealing her capabilities. She needed to confirm whether the Resolute's crew had detected the same threat she had identified. And she needed to do it while maintaining a cover that was becoming more transparent by the hour. The ship groaned around her as another massive swell passed beneath the hull. Somewhere in the storm-darkened waters below, the enemy was watching and waiting. Marin could feel them like a pressure behind her eyes, a predator's awareness of another predator circling in the depths. The hunt was beginning, and she was not yet certain whether she was the hunter or the hunted. Marin waited until Drummond's footsteps faded before slipping out of the chart room. The bridge crew was focused on their instruments, battling the storm's interference with their sensor arrays, and no one noticed the civilian surveyor moving through the shadows toward the ladder that led below decks. She needed information, and there was only one place to get it without exposing her capabilities. The ship's sonar room was located 2 levels down, adjacent to the Combat Information Center where Drummond had been summoned. If she could position herself nearby, she might overhear enough to confirm whether the crew had detected her submarine contact. The corridors were nearly empty as she descended, the storm having driven most non-essential personnel to their quarters. Emergency lighting flickered overhead, casting everything in a pale amber glow that made the ship feel like a vessel from another era. Marin moved with practiced silence, her footfalls absorbed by the rubber matting beneath her boots. She was passing the marine berthing compartment when a door swung open and a hand closed around her arm. Going somewhere, Fish Lady? Fitch's grip was iron, his fingers digging into her bicep with deliberate cruelty. Behind him, Brant emerged from the compartment, his young face tight with something that might have been reluctance or might have been anticipation. "Let go of me," Marin said calmly. "Now," Fitch laughed, the sound echoing off the metal walls. "Or what? You going to file a complaint with Human Resources?" He pulled her closer, his breath hot against her face. "Huxley wants to see you. Said it is time we had a real conversation about your place on this ship." Every nerve in Marin's body screamed for release. She could feel the combat algorithms running beneath her skin, calculating angles and pressure points, mapping the precise sequence of movements that would leave Fitch unconscious on the deck in under 2 seconds. Her training had made violence into mathematics, into something as natural as breathing. But violence meant exposure. Violence meant the end of her mission and the compromise of an assessment program that had taken years to develop. So she forced her muscles to remain passive, allowed herself to be pulled along like the helpless civilian she was pretending to be. They dragged her through a series of passages until they reached a storage compartment deep in the ship's interior. Huxley was waiting inside, perched on a crate of emergency supplies with the casual arrogance of a king on his throne. 2 more Marines flanked him, men Marin had not seen before, their faces blank with the particular emptiness of those who followed orders without question. "Ms. Solberg," Huxley said, spreading his arms in mock welcome. "Thank you for joining us. I apologize for the informal invitation, but I felt it was time we cleared the air." Fitch released her arm with a shove that sent her stumbling forward. Marin caught her balance and straightened, facing Huxley with the same neutral expression she had maintained throughout every confrontation. "What do you want, Gunnery Sergeant?" Huxley's smile did not reach his eyes. "I want the truth. I have been watching you since you came aboard, and nothing about you adds up. The way you handle yourself. The way the captain suddenly wants private meetings. The way you refuse to break no matter what we throw at you." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "So, I'm going to ask you one time. Who are you really, and what are you doing on my ship?" Marin understood that she had entered dangerous territory. Huxley was not merely suspicious now. He was convinced that she represented some kind of threat to his authority, and men like him responded to threats with escalating force. "I'm exactly who my documentation says I am," she replied. "A civilian contractor conducting authorized research. Your harassment does not change that reality." "Harassment?" Huxley laughed bitterly. "You hear that, boys? She thinks we are harassing her." He stood, closing the distance between them with predatory slowness. "Let me explain something to you, Miss Solberg. This ship is going into waters that might get very dangerous very quickly. The exercise we are running is not a game, and I cannot afford to have unknown variables in my operational space." "Then take your concerns to Captain Drummond," Marin said. "He is aware of my presence and my purpose." Something flickered across Huxley's face. Anger, but also something else. Fear, perhaps. The fear of a man who sensed that his control was slipping away. "Drummond is Navy," he spat. "He does not understand what Marines need to function. He does not understand that a unit is only as strong as its weakest link. And right now, you are that weak link. You are a distraction, a vulnerability, and vulnerabilities get people killed. He was close enough now that she could see the pulse jumping in his throat, could smell the adrenaline seeping through his pores. His hand moved toward her face, fingers extended as if he intended to touch her cheek in some grotesque parody of intimacy. Marin caught his wrist before he made contact. The movement was pure reflex, faster than thought, and she realized her mistake even as her fingers locked around his arm with crushing precision. Huxley's eyes went wide, not with pain, though she knew her grip was causing plenty of that. With recognition, with the sudden understanding that the woman before him was something far more dangerous than he had imagined. "Who taught you to move like that?" he whispered. Marin released him and stepped back, but the damage was done. She had revealed too much. The mask had slipped, and Huxley had seen what lurked beneath. The ship shuddered violently as a massive wave struck the hull. Somewhere in the distance, an alarm began to wail, and in the depths below, the submarine moved closer. The alarm cut through the tension like a blade. For a frozen moment, everyone in the storage compartment stood motionless, caught between the confrontation and the urgent wail that demanded attention. Then training took over and the Marines began moving toward the door, their conflict with Marin suddenly secondary to whatever crisis was unfolding above. Huxley lingered, his eyes still locked on her with new wariness. "This is not over," he said quietly. "When this alarm clears, you and I are going to finish our conversation, and you're going to tell me exactly what you are." He pushed past her and disappeared into the corridor, his men falling into formation behind him. Marin waited 3 heartbeats before following, keeping enough distance to avoid another confrontation while staying close enough to monitor their movements. The ship was coming alive around her. Sailors poured from compartments, rushing toward their duty stations with the controlled urgency of a crew responding to potential combat conditions. Marin caught fragments of shouted orders as she moved through the chaos. Possible contact. Unidentified vessel. Captain wants all hands. She diverted toward her survey station, knowing that her modified equipment would give her better intelligence than anything she could overhear. The compartment was empty when she arrived, and she locked the door behind her before powering up her sensors. The data confirmed her worst fears. The submarine had closed to within 500 meters of the Resolute, holding position directly beneath the ship's hull in the acoustic shadow created by the vessel's own machinery. It was a classic surveillance posture, invisible to conventional sonar, but unmistakable to anyone with the specialized training to read the subtle distortions in the water column. But that was not what triggered the alarm. The ship's sensors had detected something else, something that made Marin's blood run cold. A small object had separated from the submarine and was rising toward the surface. Then another, and another. Combat divers. At least 4 of them, ascending toward the Resolute with deliberate purpose. Marin's mind raced through the tactical implications. Combat divers operating from a submarine during a storm meant this was not a surveillance mission. This was an active operation, likely intended to plant devices on the ship's hull or conduct some form of sabotage. The exercise had been compromised, and the Resolute's crew had no idea what was ascending toward them through the dark water. She had to act. Mission parameters no longer mattered. Cover protocols were irrelevant. If those divers reached the hull, people would die. She was reaching for the door when someone pounded on it from outside. "Miss Solberg," came Chief Reese's voice. "Open up. Captain's orders." Marin unlocked the door to find Reese standing in the corridor with 2 armed sailors. The chief's expression was hard, professional, stripped of the warmth that had characterized their earlier conversations. "You need to come with us," Reese said. "The captain wants all non-essential personnel secured in the mess hall until we determine the nature of the contact." "Chief, I need to speak with Captain Drummond immediately. It is urgent." Reese's eyes narrowed. "Your surveying equipment pick up something we should know about?" There was no time for subtlety. Marin leaned closer, pitching her voice below the ambient noise of the ship. "There are combat divers in the water. At least 4, possibly more. They launched from a submarine that has been shadowing us for the past 18 hours. They are approaching the hull right now." Reese stared at her for a long moment, processing the implications of what she had just heard. A civilian contractor should not have access to that kind of intelligence. A civilian contractor should not even know what combat divers were, let alone be able to detect them through a storm using survey equipment. "Who the hell are you?" Reese breathed. "Someone who can stop this," Marin replied. "But I need access to the captain, and I need it now." The ship lurched again, harder this time, and somewhere below them metal groaned in protest. Reese made a decision, her jaw setting with resolve. "Follow me," she said, "and pray to God you are telling the truth, because if you're lying, I will personally throw you in the brig." They moved quickly through the corridors, Reese clearing a path with the authority of her rank. The mess hall was already filling with confused personnel when they passed it, sailors and Marines alike herded together by the alert protocols. Marin caught a glimpse of Fitch and Bran among the crowd, their eyes tracking her with predatory attention. Huxley was not with them. The bridge was controlled chaos when they arrived. Officers shouted coordinates, while technicians struggled with equipment that the storm had rendered unreliable. Captain Drummond stood at the center of it all, his silver hair wild and his face carved from granite as he absorbed reports from every direction. "Captain," Reese announced, "the civilian has intelligence you need to hear." Drummond turned, his eyes finding Marin with an intensity that stripped away all pretense. He had known from their earlier conversation that she was more than she appeared. Now he needed to know exactly how much more. "Speak," he commanded. Marin stepped forward, letting her cover fall away like a shed skin. "You have a Kilo-class submarine holding position directly beneath your hull," she said. "Approximately 90 seconds ago, it deployed at least 4 combat divers who are currently ascending toward the ship. Based on their approach vector, I believe they intend to plant explosive devices on your propulsion systems." The bridge went silent. Every eye turned toward her, wide with shock and disbelief. Drummond recovered first. "How do you know this?" Marin met his gaze without flinching. "Because I am Lieutenant Commander Marin Solberg, United States Navy SEALs. And those divers are about to find out they are not the only predators in these waters." The silence on the bridge lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then chaos erupted as officers scrambled to verify Marin's claims, shouting orders to sonar operators and weapon stations. Captain Drummond held up a hand, cutting through the noise with the authority of a man who had commanded ships through actual combat. "Everyone quiet," he barked. "Lieutenant Commander, assuming you are who you claim to be, what do you need?" Marin was already moving toward the tactical display, her mind shifting into operational mode. "I need diving gear, a knife, and access to the water. Your crew is not trained for underwater combat against special operations personnel." "I am." Drummond studied her for a heartbeat, then nodded. "Chief Reese, get her whatever she needs." He turned to his executive officer. "Sound general quarters and initiate anti-swimmer protocols. I want every available light on the water and security teams positioned at all hull access points." Reese grabbed Marin's arm and pulled her toward the ladder. "The rescue swimmer locker is 2 decks down," she said as they descended. "We have full diving rigs, but nothing tactical." "I do not need tactical," Marin replied. "I need mobility. A wetsuit, fins, mask, and the sharpest blade you have. These divers will be equipped for stealth, not prolonged combat. If I can intercept them before they reach the hull, I can neutralize the threat." They burst into the rescue swimmer compartment, where Reese began pulling gear from lockers with practiced efficiency. As Marin stripped off her civilian clothes and pulled on the wetsuit, Reese watched her with an expression that mixed admiration with disbelief. "I knew you were not a surveyor," the chief said. "But Navy SEALs? I did not even know women were serving the teams." "They have been for 4 years now," Marin replied, zipping the wetsuit and checking the seal. "There are not many of us, and most of our operations are classified beyond anything that reaches the regular fleet." She accepted the diving mask Reese offered and strapped a sheathed knife to her thigh. "That submarine has been tracking you since you entered the exercise zone. Whatever they are planning, it is connected to something larger than a simple intelligence operation." Reese handed her a pair of fins. "The water temperature is hovering around 50 degrees. Even with the suit, You will have maybe 30 minutes before hypothermia becomes a factor. I will not need 30 minutes, Marin said. She moved toward the compartment door, then paused. Chief, there is something else you need to know. Gunnery Sergeant Huxley was not in the mess hall when we passed. I do not know where he is, but given his behavior over the past week, I would not rule out the possibility that he might try to interfere with this operation. Reese's expression hardened. I will find him. You focus on those divers. They separated at the ladder, Reese heading up toward the main deck, while Marin descended toward the waterline access hatch. The ship was alive with activity now, sailors rushing to battle stations, the intercom crackling with orders. No one paid attention to the woman in the wetsuit moving against the flow of traffic. The access hatch was located in a small compartment near the stern, designed for rescue operations and emergency hull inspections. Marin sealed the inner door behind her and approached the outer hatch, feeling the ship's vibration through the soles of her feet. Beyond that metal barrier, the Pacific waited with all its fury and all its secrets. She closed her eyes and centered herself, running through the mental preparation ritual she had developed during years of combat operations. Fear was not the enemy. Fear was information. Fear told you that something dangerous was about to happen, and dangerous situations required focus. The water would be cold. The visibility would be near zero. The enemy would be armed and desperate. None of that changed what she had to do. She opened the hatch. The storm hit her like a physical assault, wind and spray tearing at her exposed skin with freezing intensity. The Resolute's stern rose and fell with each passing swell, the waterline alternately exposing and submerging the access point. Marin timed the motion, waiting for the precise moment when the ship's descent would give her the cleanest entry. Now, she dove headfirst into the black Pacific, and the world above disappeared. The cold was immediate and absolute, a crushing pressure that seized her muscles and demanded surrender. Marin exhaled slowly, letting her body adjust, trusting the training that had prepared her for exactly this scenario. She had swum in colder water. She had swum in rougher conditions. She had swum until her body screamed for death, and then swum further because the mission required it. This was nothing. This was home. She oriented herself against the ship's hull, using the massive metal surface as a reference point while her eyes adjusted to the darkness. The submarine's divers would be approaching from below, ascending through the thermocline where their thermal signatures would be masked by the temperature differential. She needed to descend to position herself between them and their target. Marin kicked downward, the fins propelling her through the turbulent water with powerful efficiency. The pressure increased as she descended, squeezing her ears until she equalized with practiced ease. 20 feet, 40 feet, 60 feet. There, movement in the darkness below. For shapes rising in formation, their bodies streamlined and purposeful. The hunters had arrived, and they had no idea what was waiting for them. Marin let the darkness embrace her as she descended toward the approaching divers. Her heartbeat slowed automatically, her body conserving oxygen through the physiological adaptations that years of training had carved into her nervous system. In the black water, stripped of all technology and backup, she was exactly what the Navy had spent millions of dollars creating. A weapon that could think. A predator that could adapt. The enemy divers were moving in a standard infiltration pattern, 2 forward scouts with 2 support swimmers trailing behind. Their equipment was high quality but foreign, confirming her suspicion that this was a state-sponsored operation rather than a terrorist cell. They carried waterproof bags that almost certainly contained the explosive devices intended for the Resolute's hull. She had to stop them before they reached the ship. Once they planted their charges, the detonation would be inevitable. Marin angled her approach to intercept the lead diver, using the ambient noise of the storm and the ship's machinery to mask her movements. The water was her ally here, transmitting sound in ways that could be exploited by someone who understood its properties. She positioned herself above and behind the point man, letting the current carry her into striking range. The attack was silent and absolute. Her arm wrapped around the diver's neck from behind, her other hand trapping his knife arm before he could draw his weapon. She squeezed with the precise pressure she had practiced thousands of times, cutting off blood flow to his brain while preventing him from thrashing or signaling his companions. 8 seconds later, his body went limp. She released him and let the current take his unconscious form into the depths. 1 down, 3 to go. The second scout sensed something wrong. He turned, his headlamp cutting a pale beam through the murky water, searching for his missing partner. Marin was already moving, circling behind him while he focused on the empty space where the point man should have been. This one was faster. He caught a glimpse of her shadow and spun, drawing his combat knife in a single fluid motion. But Marin had anticipated the reaction. She was inside his guard before the blade could complete its arc, her own knife finding the gap between his rebreather straps and his exposure suit. The blade sank deep, and the diver's eyes went wide behind his mask before the light faded from them. 2 down. The support swimmers had realized they were under attack. They abandoned their approach pattern and split apart, one diving deeper while the others surged toward the surface. Marin made an instant tactical calculation. The one heading for the surface was likely trying to warn the submarine. The one going deep was probably carrying the explosives. She went deep. The third diver was good. He sensed her pursuit and turned to face her, his knife extended in a defensive posture. They circled each other in the darkness, 2 shadows dancing at 60 feet below the storm-tossed surface. Marin could feel her oxygen reserves depleting, could sense the cold seeping deeper into her muscles despite the wetsuit's protection. She had minutes left before her body started shutting down. The diver attacked first, a lunging strike aimed at her throat. Marin deflected the blade with her forearm and countered with a knee to his midsection, but the water resistance robbed the strike of its force. They grappled, tumbling through the water column in a tangle of limbs and bubbles. His hand found her mask and ripped it away, leaving her blind in the black water. But Marin did not need to see. She had trained for this. Hours in blacked-out pools, learning to fight by feel and instinct alone. Her fingers found the pressure point at his wrist and twisted, forcing him to release his knife. Then she was behind him, her arm locked around his throat in the same chokehold she had used on the first diver. He struggled longer than the others, his training evident in the way he tried to break her grip. But Marin held on with the desperate strength of someone who knew that failure meant the deaths of everyone on the ship above. Finally, his movements slowed and stopped. 3 down. She released him and retrieved his equipment bag, confirming by touch that it contained the explosive devices. The charges were military grade, enough to cripple the Resolute's propulsion and leave it dead in the water. She secured the bag to her own body and turned toward the surface. The fourth diver was gone, presumably racing back to the submarine with news of the failed operation. Marin could not pursue him, not with her oxygen running low and her body temperature dropping toward dangerous levels. She had stopped the immediate threat. That would have to be enough. She kicked toward the surface, her lungs burning and her muscles screaming. The darkness seemed endless, a void that swallowed all sense of direction and distance. For a terrifying moment, she wondered if she had become disoriented, if she was swimming sideways or even downward instead of up. Then light appeared above her, pale and diffuse, but unmistakably the glow of the Resolute's emergency floods illuminating the churning surface. Marin adjusted her course and pushed harder, driving through the last 20 feet with the final reserves of her strength. She broke the surface gasping, the storm's fury slamming into her like a physical blow. Waves crashed over her head, trying to drag her back down, but she had not survived this long to drown within sight of safety. She raised one arm and activated the emergency beacon she had strapped to her wrist before entering the water. Above her, the Resolute's searchlights swung toward her position. Voices shouted through the wind. A rescue line arced through the rain and splashed down 3 feet from her head. Marin grabbed it and held on as the crew began to pull her home. They hauled her over the railing like a caught fish, her body hitting the deck with a wet slap that knocked what little breath remained from her lungs. Hands grabbed at her, pulling the equipment bag free, wrapping thermal blankets around her shaking shoulders. Voices overlapped in a chaos of concern and confusion, but Marin could barely process the words through the fog of hypothermia clouding her thoughts. Chief Reese's face appeared above her, sharp with worry. "Stay with me, Lieutenant Commander. Medical team is on the way." "The bag," Marin managed through chattering teeth. "Explosives. Secure them." Reese barked an order, and someone rushed the bag away toward the bomb disposal team. Marin let herself collapse against the deck, staring up at the storm-black sky while her body tried to remember how to generate heat. She had been in the water for 23 minutes. Another 5, and she would not have made it back. Footsteps pounded across the deck, and then Captain Drummond was kneeling beside her, his silver hair plastered to his skull by the rain. His eyes swept over her trembling form, taking an empty knife sheath, the blood that was not hers staining her wet suit, the 1,000-yard stare of someone who had just fought for her life in the dark. "Report," he said quietly. "3 hostiles neutralized," Marin replied, forcing her voice to steady. "4th escaped back to the submarine. Recovered explosive devices intended for your propulsion systems. The sub will likely withdraw now that their operation is compromised, but I recommend maintaining battle stations until you can confirm their departure." Drummond absorbed this with the calm of a man who had seen combat before. "You went into that water alone against 4 train divers," he said, "with nothing but a knife and a wet suit." "It is what I was trained to do, Captain." Something shifted in his expression, a recognition that went beyond professional respect. He had commanded sailors for 3 decades, had watched men and women perform acts of courage under fire, but this was something different. This was a warrior who had concealed herself among his crew, who had endured harassment and humiliation without complaint, and who had then thrown herself into a freezing ocean to save people who had treated her as an enemy. The medical team arrived with a stretcher, but Marin waved them off. "I can walk," she insisted. "Help me up." Reese and another sailor pulled her to her feet, keeping hands on her arms as she swayed against the ship's motion. The thermal blankets helped, but her core temperature was still dangerously low. She needed to get inside, needed warm fluids and heated blankets, but there was something she had to do first. "Where's Huxley?" she asked. Reese's face darkened. "We found him 15 minutes ago. He was trying to access the communications room. Said he needed to report your activities to Fleet Command." Marin felt a cold that had nothing to do with the water. What exactly was he trying to report? That you had seized control of the ship and were impersonating a military officer. That you needed to be stopped before you endangered the crew. Reese paused, her jaw tight. He was attempting to send an unencrypted message. If he had succeeded, every vessel monitoring these frequencies would have heard it, including that submarine. The implication hit Marin like a physical blow. Huxley had nearly compromised the entire operation. His paranoid obsession with exposing her had almost handed the enemy exactly the intelligence they needed. Whether through malice or incompetence, his actions could have gotten everyone on this ship killed. "Where is he now?" "Confined to quarters under armed guard," Drummond answered. "He will face court-martial when we return to port." His voice carried the weight of a commander who took no pleasure in destroying a career, but who understood that some failures could not be overlooked. "I should have acted sooner. The harassment, the intimidation. I let it continue because I thought it was manageable." "You could not have predicted this," Marin said. "Perhaps not, but I should have protected you regardless." Drummond met her eyes with something that looked like shame. "You were a guest on my ship, and I allowed you to be treated as an enemy. Whatever your mission here was, whatever assessment you were conducting, I failed that test." Marin considered her response carefully. The assessment program was designed to identify weaknesses in operational security and crew cohesion. Huxley represented exactly the kind of vulnerability they were searching for, a competent operator whose personal demons made him a liability in unpredictable situations. But that was a conversation for official reports and classified briefings. Right now, standing on the rain-swept deck of a ship she had just saved, Marin found that she cared less about assessments than she did about the man before her. "You did not fail," "Captain," she said finally, "you asked the right questions when others would have looked away. You trusted me when you had every reason not to. And when the crisis came, you gave me what I needed to stop it." She let a small smile cross her exhausted face. "That is not failure. That is command." Drummond stared at her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Let's get you inside, Lieutenant Commander. You have earned some warmth." They helped her toward the hatch, and behind them, the storm began to ease. The medical bay was small but efficient, equipped with the essentials needed to stabilize casualties until they could reach a proper hospital. Marin sat on the examination table wrapped in heated blankets, and Foreline feeding warm saline in her veins while the ship's corpsman monitored her vital signs with growing relief. "Core temperature is coming back up," he announced. "Another hour, and you should be out of the danger zone." He shook his head in disbelief. 23 minutes in 50-degree water without a dry suit. "You should be dead, Lieutenant Commander." "I have had worse swims," Marin replied. The corpsman wisely chose not to ask for details. The hatch opened, and Chief Reese entered, her uniform still damp from the rescue operation. She carried a steaming mug that she pressed into Marin's trembling hands. "Coffee," she said. "Figured you could use something warm that was not being pumped through a needle." Marin accepted it gratefully, letting the heat seep into her palms. The simple kindness of the gesture struck her more deeply than she expected. For the past week, she had been treated as an intruder, a contamination to be expelled. Now she was being cared for like a member of the crew. "How is the ship?" she asked. Reese leaned against the bulkhead, her arms crossed. "Submarine broke contact about 20 minutes ago. Sonar tracked it heading southeast at flank speed. Whatever they were planning, your intervention convinced them it was not worth the risk." She paused, something shifting in her expression. "The explosives you recovered have been secured. Preliminary analysis suggests they were sophisticated enough to cripple our propulsion and leave us dead in the water. If those divers had reached the hull, we would be drifting toward hostile waters right now with no way to maneuver." "It was worth it," Marin said simply. Reese studied her for a long moment. "Can I ask you something personal?" "You can ask. I cannot promise to answer." A ghost of a smile crossed Reese's face. "Fair enough." She took a breath. "Why did you let it go on so long? The harassment, the fish heads, Fitch cornering you in corridors. You could have ended it any time. One demonstration of what you were capable of, and Huxley would have backed off." Marin considered the question carefully. "It deserved an honest answer. My mission required me to remain invisible," she said finally. "Breaking cover to defend my pride would have compromised months of planning. But beyond that, I suppose I wanted to see what would happen, whether anyone would intervene, whether the crew would recognize what was happening and choose to act. And did they? Some did. You did. Captain Drummond did in his way." Marin took a sip of the coffee, letting its warmth spread through her chest. The assessment was never just about security vulnerabilities. It was about character, about whether this crew would protect one of their own, even when it was difficult, even when the person being targeted was an outsider. Reese absorbed this in silence. "Then I hope we passed," she said quietly. Before Marin could respond, the hatch opened again and Captain Drummond entered, followed by a communications officer carrying a portable encryption terminal. The captain's expression was grave but controlled, the face of a man who had just received significant news and was still processing its implications. "Lieutenant Commander," he said, "I have Master Chief Whitmore on secure channels. He wants to speak with you directly." Marin set down her coffee and accepted the terminal, angling the screen so that only she could see it. The face that appeared was weathered and familiar, a man she had served with for nearly a decade. Ezra Whitmore had been her mentor during her first years in the teams, the steady presence who had guided her through operations that still appeared in her nightmares. "Selkie," Whitmore said, using her team call sign. "I hear you went for a swim. The situation required immediate action, Master Chief. I made a judgment call that saved a destroyer and exposed an enemy operation we did not know existed." Whitmore's craggy face showed no emotion, but Marin knew him well enough to read the approval in his eyes. The submarine you identified was operating under false credentials. Intelligence believes it was conducting reconnaissance for a larger operation targeting the exercise. Your intervention disrupted their timeline and forced them to abort. What about the fourth diver? The one who escaped? Being tracked. Whitmore paused. You did good work, Marin. The kind of work that does not get medals because it never officially happened. But I want you to know that the people who matter are aware of what you accomplished tonight. Marin felt something loosen in her chest, a tension she had not realized she was carrying. Thank you, Master Chief. There is one more thing. Whitmore's expression shifted slightly. The assessment you were conducting on the Resolute. Command wants your preliminary report before you return to port, specifically regarding the personnel issues you encountered. Marin glanced at Captain Drummond, who stood waiting with the quiet dignity of a man prepared to accept whatever judgment she rendered. She thought about Huxley and his poisonous obsession. She thought about Fitch and Brandt and the culture that had allowed their behavior to flourish. But she also thought about Reese, who had noticed what others ignored. About Ensign Park, who had defended her when it cost him nothing to stay silent. About Drummond himself, who had trusted a stranger when trust was the hardest thing to give. My preliminary assessment, she said carefully, is that this crew contains both significant vulnerabilities and significant strengths. The vulnerabilities are being addressed through appropriate disciplinary channels. The strengths deserve recognition. Whitmore nodded slowly. Understood. Get some rest, Selkie. You have earned it. The screen went dark, and Marin handed the terminal back to the communications officer. When she looked up, Drummond was watching her with an expression she could not quite read. Thank you, he said quietly, for the assessment and for everything else. Marin pulled the heated blankets tighter around her shoulders and allowed herself to feel, for just a moment, like she belonged. Word spread through the ship like fire through dry timber. By the time Marin was cleared to leave the medical bay, every sailor and Marine aboard the Resolute knew who she was and what she had done. The corridors that had felt hostile just hours earlier now parted before her with a mixture of awe and shame, crew members stepping aside and nodding with the awkward respect of people who had witnessed something they did not fully understand. Chief Reese walked beside her, having appointed herself an unofficial escort. The mess hall first, she suggested. You need real food, not just for fluids. And I suspect there are some people who want to see you. Marin was too exhausted to argue. She let Reese guide her through the passageways, acutely aware of the eyes tracking her movement from every doorway and junction. The woman who had been invisible for a week was now the most visible person on the ship. The mess hall fell silent when she entered. Dozens of faces turned toward her, a sea of expressions ranging from curiosity to guilt to something that looked almost like reverence. Sailors who had ignored her harassment sat, frozen with their forks halfway to their mouths. Marines who had laughed at Huxley's jokes stared at their plates as if the answers to their shame might be written there. Then someone started clapping. It was Ensign Park, the young officer who had defended her days earlier when it would have been easier to stay silent. He stood at his table near the back of the room, his hands coming together in a steady rhythm that echoed off the metal walls. One by one, others joined him. Sailors rose from their seats. Marines pushed back their chairs and stood. The applause built like a wave, washing over Marin with an intensity that threatened to crack the composure she had maintained through everything else. Reese leaned close to her ear. They know what you did, she said, and they know what they failed to do. This is their way of apologizing. Marin stood in the doorway, letting the sound wash over her, and felt something shift deep in her chest. She had endured worse than applause. She had endured worse than silence. But this moment, this recognition from people who had witnessed her at her lowest and now saw her at her highest, touched something she had thought was buried too deep to reach. She raised a hand, acknowledging the gesture, and the applause gradually faded. People returned to their seats, but the atmosphere had changed. The mess hall that had been a space of isolation was now something else entirely. Reese guided her to a table near the galley, where a cook was already preparing a plate piled high with food that actually looked appetizing. Word came down from the captain. The cook explained with a sheepish grin. Best we have for the lieutenant commander. Marin accepted the plate with genuine gratitude and began eating with the mechanical efficiency of someone who understood that food was fuel and fuel was survival. She was halfway through her meal when a shadow fell across her table. Lance Corporal Brant stood before her, his young face pale and his hands trembling at his sides. He looked like a man approaching his own execution, every line of his body radiating fear and guilt in equal measure. "Lieutenant Commander," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I need to say something." Marin set down her fork and gave him her full attention. "Go ahead." Brant swallowed hard. "I was there. Every time. When Huxley cornered you in the corridor. When Fitch put the fish on your pillow. When they dragged you to that storage compartment. I was there and I did nothing." His voice cracked. "I knew it was wrong. I knew they were going too far. But I was scared of what would happen if I spoke up. Scared of being on the outside. Scared of Huxley. And now I am more scared of being the kind of man who watches someone get hurt and does nothing to stop it." Brant's eyes glistened with moisture he was fighting to control. "I know sorry does not fix anything. I know you have every right to hate me. But I needed you to know that I see what I did. What I failed to do. And I will carry that with me for the rest of my career." Marin studied him for a long moment, reading the genuine anguish in his features. He was young, probably no more than 24, still forming the man he would eventually become. The choices he made now would shape every choice that followed. "Fear is not a character flaw," she said finally. "Every person in this room has felt fear. What matters is what you do with it." She paused, letting the words settle. "You came here tonight. You looked me in the eye and took responsibility for your failure. That took courage. Maybe more courage than standing up to Huxley would have required." Brant blinked, confusion mixing with his guilt. "I do not understand." "It is easy to be brave in the moment," Marin explained. "Adrenaline carries you through. But facing your own failures afterward, without excuses, without justification, that requires a different kind of strength." She gestured to the empty seat across from her. "Sit down, Lance Corporal." He sat, looking stunned. "You made a mistake," Marin continued. "A serious one. But you're not defined by your worst moment unless you choose to be. What defines you is what you do next." She held his gaze with unflinching intensity. "So the question is, what are you going to do next?" Brant was silent for a long moment, his jaw working as he processed her words. Then something hardened in his expression, a resolution taking shape behind his eyes. "Better," he said quietly. "I'm going to do better." Marin nodded slowly. "Then we have nothing more to discuss." She returned to her meal, and after a moment, Brant rose and walked away. But his shoulders were straighter than when he had arrived, and his step carried a purpose that had not been there before. Reese watched him go with an approving expression. "You could have destroyed him," she observed. "One word to command, and his career would be over." "Destroying him would not undo what happened," Marin replied. "And the Navy needs people who can learn from their mistakes." She took another bite of food. "Besides, I have a feeling Lance Corporal Brant is going to spend the rest of his service making sure no one else goes through what I did. That is worth more than any punishment." Reese smiled, a genuine warmth breaking through her professional demeanor. "You're something else, Lieutenant Commander." Marin allowed herself a small smile in return. "I'm a SEAL, Chief. We are all something else." The storm broke just before dawn, the clouds parting to reveal a sky streaked with crimson and gold. Marin stood on the observation deck where her journey had begun, watching the Pacific transform from a churning monster into something almost peaceful. The water that had nearly killed her now stretched toward the horizon like hammered bronze, its surface broken only by the gentle swells that rocked the Resolute in a rhythm that felt almost like breathing. She had slept for 6 hours, the deepest sleep she had experienced in months, and awakened to find fresh utilities folded at the foot of her cot. Someone had replaced her ruined civilian clothes with a proper Navy uniform, complete with the insignia of her actual rank. Lieutenant Commander Solberg was no longer hiding. Footsteps approached from behind, and she turned to find Captain Drummond joining her at the railing. He looked different in the morning light, the tension of the previous night replaced by something that resembled peace. He carried 2 steaming mugs and offered one to her without ceremony. "I thought you might appreciate some company," he said, "and some decent coffee." Marin accepted the mug with a nod of thanks. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the sunrise paint the water in shades of fire and honey. "I received word from Fleet Command this morning," Drummond said eventually. "The submarine you encountered has been identified as part of a larger reconnaissance operation targeting our Pacific exercises. Your intervention provided intelligence that is already being used to adjust our defensive posture across the region." "I was just doing my job, Captain." Drummond shook his head slowly. "No, your job was to observe and assess. What you did went far beyond that. You risked your life for people who had given you every reason to let them fend for themselves. That is not duty. That is character." Marin took a sip of coffee, letting the warmth settle into her chest. "Perhaps duty and character are the same thing," she offered, "at least for people like us." The captain considered this for a moment, then nodded. "Perhaps they are." They watched the sunrise in silence for another minute before Drummond spoke again. "Huxley will be transferred to a shore facility when we reach port," he said. "The formal court-martial will take several months, but the outcome is not in doubt. His career is over." Marin felt no satisfaction at the news. Huxley had been a good Marine once, according to his service record. Somewhere along the way, something had broken inside him, transforming dedication into obsession and pride into poison. His downfall was a tragedy, even if it was also justice. "What about Fitch?" she asked. "Administrative separation. He will be out of the Corps within 60 days. Drummond paused. "Brant, on the other hand, has requested a transfer to a new unit where he can start fresh. I approved it this morning." "Good," Marin said. "He deserves a second chance." "Thanks to you." She shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. "I did not do anything except tell him the truth. Sometimes that is the hardest thing to do." Drummond turned to face her directly, his weathered features softened by the golden light. "Lieutenant Commander, I want you to know that what happened on this ship will not be forgotten. Not by me, not by the crew. You showed us something about ourselves, both the failures we need to address and the potential we have to be better." Marin met his gaze with quiet intensity. "Every ship has problems, Captain. What matters is whether the people aboard are willing to face them. Your crew faced theirs when it counted. That is not nothing." The hatch behind them opened, and Chief Reese emerged onto the observation deck. She was smiling, a rare expression that transformed her stern features into something almost youthful. "Sorry to interrupt," she said, "but there is something you both need to see." She led them to the main deck, where the crew had assembled in formation. Sailors and Marines stood shoulder to shoulder, their differences temporarily forgotten in the face of a common purpose. At the front of the formation, Ensign Park held a small wooden box that Marin did not recognize. Captain Drummond stepped forward to address his people, his voice carrying across the deck with practiced authority. "Last night, this crew faced a threat we were not prepared for. We survived because one person among us had the skill, the courage, and the integrity to act when action was needed. She did this despite being treated as an outsider, despite being harassed and marginalized by some of our own. Her actions saved this ship and everyone aboard it." He turned to Marin, gesturing for her to join him at the front. "Lieutenant Commander Marin Solberg is a Navy SEAL, one of the finest warriors our nation produces. But more than that, she is a person of extraordinary character. She could have revealed herself at any time and ended the harassment she endured. Instead, she chose to observe, to assess, and ultimately to protect people who had given her no reason to do so." Park stepped forward with the wooden box, opening it to reveal a ship's medallion, the Resolute's official coin reserved for those who had demonstrated exceptional service. "This is not an official commendation," Drummond continued. "Those will come through proper channels. This is something more personal. It is our way of saying thank you, and our way of acknowledging that we failed you before we understood who you were." Marin accepted the medallion, running her thumb across its engraved surface. The weight of it felt significant, not because of the medal, but because of what it represented. Recognition, belonging, the acknowledgement that she had earned her place among them through actions rather than credentials. She looked out at the assembled crew, at the faces that had ignored her, and the faces that had tormented her, and the faces that had ultimately come to respect her. They were all watching now, waiting for her to speak. "Thank you," she said simply. "Not for the medallion, but for showing me that this crew knows how to come together when it matters. That is what makes a ship strong. Not the weapons or the technology, but the people who serve aboard it." She paused, letting her gaze sweep across the formation. "I came here to assess your readiness. What I found was a crew capable of extraordinary things when they choose to be. Do not forget that." The formation broke into applause, spontaneous and genuine, and Marin felt something she had not expected to feel. Pride, not in herself, but in the people around her. They had stumbled, but they had also risen, and that was all anyone could ask. If this story moved you, we would love to hear from you. Drop a comment and let us know your favorite part, your favorite character, or share if you have ever witnessed someone reveal hidden strength when it mattered most. Stories like these remind us that courage takes many forms, and sometimes the greatest warriors are the ones we least expect. Later that morning, as the Resolute turned toward homeport, Marin stood alone at the stern and watched the Pacific stretch endlessly behind them. The water that had been her battlefield was now just water again, vast and indifferent and beautiful. She had survived another mission, saved another ship, added another classified operation to a record that would never be fully known. But as the coastline appeared on the horizon and the crew prepared for their return to shore, Marin found herself thinking not about the combat or the recognition, but about a young lance corporal who had chosen to be better, about a chief who had noticed what others ignored, about a captain who had trusted a stranger when trust was the hardest thing to give. The ocean had tested her. The ship had tested her. And in the end, both had revealed something she had almost forgotten. She was not just built for water. She was built for this, for the moments when courage mattered, for the people who needed someone to stand in the darkness on their behalf. Lieutenant Commander Marin Solberg, call sign Selkie, watched the shore approach and allowed herself to smile. She was going home, and somewhere out there, another mission was waiting,